Hi, fourth grade. Here we go with Where the Red Fern Grows. I'm going to read in this video chapter 17. When we were last in school, we left off with chapter 16. And in case you forget, what was happening was Billy, his dad, his grandpa, and the judge were out hunting in the final round of that raccoon hunting contest. It's just down to Billy's hounds and the two big Walker hounds who have won the cup 3 years in a row. So here we go with chapter 17. Looking up to the sky, Papa said, "That doesn't look good up there. I think we're in for a storm." The sky had turned a dark gray. Fast-moving clouds were rolling through the heavens. Grandpa said, "Looks like we're gonna get some wind, too." Scared and thinking that everyone might want to stop hunting because of a few clouds, I said, "If a storm is brewing, it's a good night to hunt. All game stirs just before a storm." 30 minutes later, Papa said, "Listen." We stood still. A low, moaning sound could be heard in the top of the tall sycamores. Grandpa said, "I was afraid of that. We're going to get a storm." We heard a rattling in the leaves. It was beginning to sleet. The air turned cold and chilly. From far downriver, we heard the deep baying of a hound on a trail. It was old Dan. Seconds later, the rhythmic crying of little Ann could be heard. Swallowing the lump that had jumped up into my throat, I whooped as loud as I could. The ground was turning white with sleet. The storm had really set in. We hurried along. I said to Papa, "If this keeps up, that old raccoon won't run for long. He'll head right for his den." "If it gets much worse," Grandpa said, "I know some raccoon hunters that won't be out here very long. They'll be frozen too stiff to run." The judge asked if there was any danger of us getting lost. "I don't know," Papa said. "It's all strange country to me." My dogs' voices sounded far away. I knew they were much closer than they sounded, as they were downwind from us. Finding 3 large sycamores growing close together, we stopped on the leeward side. Papa shouted above the wind, "I don't know if we can take much more of this." "It is bad," Grandpa replied, "and it looks like it's only going to get worse." "You can't even see over 15 feet now," the judge said. "Do you think we can even find the buggy?" "I think we better find the buggy," Papa said. I could no longer hear the voices of my dogs. This had me worried. I didn't want to leave them out here in this storm. "Can anyone hear the hounds?" Grandpa asked. "I can't," Papa said. The judge spoke up. "Fellas, I think we have to go in," he said. "There's no telling where those dogs are. They may have crossed the river even." Scared and knowing that I had to do something, I said, "They're closer than you think, probably treed by now. You can't hear them because of this wind." I begged, "Let's go just a little further." There was no reply, and no one made a move to leave the shelter of the trees. Taking a few steps, I said, "I'll take the lead. Just please follow me." "Billy, we couldn't find them," Papa said. "You can't see or hear a thing out here. We'd better start back to camp." "I think he's right," the judge said. At this remark, I cried out. "I've been in storms like this before, all by myself. I've never left my dogs in the woods, and I'm not going to now, even if I have to look for them myself." No one answered. "Please, just a little further," I begged. "I just know we'll hear them." Still, no one spoke or made a move. Stepping over to my father, I buried my face in his old coat. Sobbing, I pleaded with him not to turn back. He patted my head. "Billy," he said, "a man could freeze to death in this storm. And besides, your dogs are smart. They'll give up and come in." "That's what has me worried," I cried. They won't come in. They won't, Papa. Little Ann might, but not old Dan. He'd die before he left a coon in a tree. Papa was undecided. Making up his mind, he stepped away from the tree and said to the others, "I'm going with Billy. You fellows coming or heading back?" He turned and followed me. Grandpa and the judge fell in behind him. By this time, the ground was covered in a thin white layer of sleet. We kept slipping and falling. I could hear Grandpa mumbling and grumbling. The wind-driven sleet stung our skin like thousands of pricking needles. Strong gusts of wind growled and moaned through the tops of the tall timber. Once, during a momentary lull of the storm, I thought I heard a baying of a hound. I told my father I thought I had heard old Dan. "From which direction?" he asked. "From that way," I said, pointing to the left. We started on. A few minutes later, Papa stopped. He shouted to my grandfather, "Did you hear anything?" "No," Grandpa shouted back. "I can't hear anything in this storm." "I thought I did, but I'm not sure," the judge said. "What direction did you hear it from?" Papa asked. "Over that way," the judge said, pointing to the right. "That's the way it sounded to me too," Papa said. At that moment, all of us heard the deep voice of old Dan. "It sounds like they're close," Grandpa said. "Let's split up," said the judge. "Maybe one of us will find them." "No," Papa said. "It'd be too easy for us to get lost in this storm." "I think they're to the right of us," I said. "I do too," Papa said. We trudged on. Old Dan bawled again. The sound of his voice seemed to be all around us. "The way this wind is whipping the sound through the timber," the judge said, "we'd be lucky if we ever found them." Papa shouted over the roar of the wind, "We can't take much more of this. We will freeze." These men were giving up. I felt the knot again as it crawled up in my throat. Salt water froze on my eyelashes. Kneeling down, I put my ear close to the icy ground in hopes I could hear my dogs. But I couldn't hear anything above the roar of this blizzard. Standing up, I peered this way and that. All I could see was a white wall of whirling sleet. I closed my eyes and said a silent prayer and hoped for a miracle. We heard a sharp crack and a loud crashing noise. A large limb, torn from a tree by the strong wind, fell to the ground. The sharp crack of the limb gave me an idea. Shouting to my father, I said, "Shoot your gun, Papa! If my dogs are close enough to hear it, maybe little Ann will come to us." Papa didn't hesitate. Pointing the gun high over his head, he pulled the trigger. The sharp crack rang out into the teeth of the storm. We waited. Just when I had given up all hope and had sunk to the lowest depth of despair, out of the white wall of driving sleet, my little dog came to me. I knelt down and gathered her in my arms. Taking one of the lead ropes from my pocket, I tied it to her collar. I said, "Find him, little girl. Please find old Dan." Right then, I didn't care about raccoons, the competition, the gold cup, or anything. All I wanted was my dogs. I don't quite know how she did it. Straight into the face of the storm, little Ann led us. Time after time, she would stop and turn her head this way and that. I knew she couldn't scent or see anything. Instinct alone was guiding her. Over a winding and twisting trail, we followed. Coming out of the bottoms, she led us into a thick canebrake. The tall stalks sheltered us from the storm. The roaring of the wind didn't seem so loud. Like ghostly figures, large trees loomed out of the almost solid mass. Falling and stumbling, we kept pushing on. Grandpa shouted, "Hold up a minute!" We stopped. "Do you think that hounds know what she's doing?" the judge asked. "Maybe we're just running around in circles following her." Looking at me, Papa said, I hope she does. Some of these cane brakes cover miles. If we get lost in here, we'll be in bad shape. Grandpa said, I think we've gone too far. The last time I heard old Dan, he sounded close. That was because the wind carried the sound, I said. The judge spoke up. Fellas, no dog is worth the lives of 3 men. Now let's do the smart thing and get out of here while we can. Our clothes are wet. If we keep on wandering around in this jungle, we will freeze to death. It doesn't look like this blizzard is going to let up. I could hear the roar of the blizzard back in the thick timber of the bottoms. 2 large limbs being rubbed together by the strong wind made a grinding, creaking sound. The tall, slender cane around us rattled and swayed. I could feel the silence closing in. I knew the judge's cold logic had had its effect on my father and grandfather. The men had given up. There was no hope left for me. Kneeling down, I put my arms around little Anne. I felt the warm heat from her moist tongue caressing my ear. Closing my eyes, I said, Please, Dan, bawl one more time. Just one more time. I waited for my plea to be answered. With its loud roaring, the north wind seemed to be laughing at me. All around, tall stalks of cane were weaving and dancing to the rattling rhythm of their knife-edged blades. My father tried to talk above the wind, but his words were lost in the storm. Just before another blast, clear as a foghorn on a stormy sea, old Dan's voice rang loud and clear. It seemed louder than the roar of the wind or the skeleton-like rustling of the tall, swaying cane. I jumped to my feet. My heart did a complete flip-flop. The knot in my throat felt as big as an apple. I tried to whoop, but it was no use. Little Anne bawled and tugged on the rope. There was no mistaking the direction this time. We knew that little Anne had been right all along. Straight as an arrow, she led us the rest of the way to him. Old Dan was treed down in a deep gully. I slid off the bank and ran to him. His back was covered in a layer of frozen sleet. His frost-covered whiskers stood out straight as porcupine quills. I worked the wedges of ice from between his toes and scraped the sleet from his body with my hands. Little Anne came over and tried to wash his face. He didn't like it. Jerking loose from me, he ran over to the tree, reared up on it, and started bawling, treed. Hearing shouting from the bank above me, I looked up. I could dimly see my papa and the judge through the sleet. At first I thought they were shouting to me, but on peering closer I could see that they had their backs to me. Catching hold of some long stalks of cane that were hanging down from the steep bank, I pulled myself up to them. Papa shouted in my ear, "Something has happened to your grandpa, Billy." Turning to the judge, he said, "He was behind me. When was the last time you saw him?" "I don't know for sure," the judge said. "I guess it was back there when we heard the hound bawl." "Didn't you hear anything?" "Hear anything?" the judge exclaimed. "How could I hear anything in all that noise? I thought he was behind me all the time and didn't miss him until we got here." I could not hold back my tears. My grandfather was lost and wandering around in this wild jungle alone. Screaming for him, I started back. Papa caught me. He shouted, "Billy, don't do that." I tried to tear away from him, but his grip on my arm was firm. "Shoot your gun," the judge said. Papa shot, time after time, but it was useless. We got no answer. Little Anne came up out of the washout. She stood and stared at me. Turning, she disappeared quickly into the thick cane. Minutes later, we heard her. It was a long, mournful cry. The only times I had ever heard my little dog cry like that was when she was baying at a bright Ozark moon, or when someone played a French harp or a fiddle close to her ear. She didn't stop until we reached her. There Grandpa lay, as he had fallen, face down in the icy sleet. His right foot was wedged in the fork of a broken box elder limb. When his ankle had twisted, the searing pain must have knocked him unconscious. Papa worked Grandpa's foot free and turned him over. I sat down and placed his head in my lap. While Papa and the judge massaged his arms and legs, I wiped the frozen sleet from his eyes and face. Burying my face in his iron gray hair, I cried and begged God not to let my grandfather die. I think he's gone, the judge said. No, I don't think so, Papa said. He took a bad fall when that limb tripped him, but he hasn't been lying here long enough to be frozen. I think he's just unconscious. Papa lifted him to a sitting position and told the judge to start lightly slapping his face. Grandpa moaned and moved his head. He's coming around, Papa said. I asked Papa if we could get him back to the gully where old Dan was. I had noticed there was very little wind down there, and we could build a fire to warm him up. That's a great idea, Billy, he said. We'll build a fire, and then one of us can go for help. Papa and the judge made a seat by catching each other's wrists. They eased Grandpa between them. By the time we reached the washout, Grandpa was fully conscious again and was mumbling and grumbling. He couldn't see why he had to be carried like a baby. After easing him over the bank and down into the gully, we built a large fire. Papa took his knife and cut the boot from Grandpa's swollen foot. Grandpa grunted and groaned from the pain. I felt so sorry for him, but there was nothing I could do but watch. Papa examined his foot. Shaking his head, he said, "Boy, that's a bad one. It's either broken or badly sprained. I'll go for help." Grandpa spoke up. "Now you wait just a minute. I'm not going to let you go out in that blizzard by yourself. What if something happens to you? No one would know." "Well, what time is it?" he asked. The judge looked at his watch. "It's almost 5 o'clock, he said. "Well, it's not long now till daylight," Grandpa said. "Then if you want to go, you'll be able to see where you're going. Now help me get propped up against this bank. I'll be all right. It doesn't hurt anymore. It's numb now." "He's right," the judge said. "You sure you can stand it?" Papa asked. Grandpa roared like a bear. "Sure I can stand it. It's nothing but a sprained ankle. I'm not gonna die. Now build that fire up a little more." While Papa and the judge made Grandpa comfortable, I carried wood for the fire. "There's no use standing around here looking at me," Grandpa said. "I'm all right. You go get that raccoon out of that tree. That's why we're here, isn't it?" Up until then, the raccoon hunting competition had practically been forgotten. The tree that old Dan had balled was about 30 feet from our fire. We walked over and took a good look at it for the first time. My dogs, seeing we were finally going to pay attention to them, started bawling and running around the tree. Papa said, "It's not much of a tree, but an old box elder snag. There's not a single limb on it." "I can't see any coon," said the judge. "It must be hollow." Papa beat on its side with the axe. It gave forth a loud booming sound. He said, "It's hollow, all right." He stepped back a few steps, scraped his feet on the slick ground for good footing, and said, "Stand back and hold those hounds. I'm going to cut it down. We need some wood for our fire anyway." Squatting down between my dogs, I held on to both their collars. Papa notched the old snag so it would fall away from our fire. As the heavy axe chewed its way into the tree, it began to lean and crack. Papa stopped chopping. He said to the judge, "Come on and help me. I think we can push it over now." After much grunting, pushing, snapping, and popping, the tree fell. I turned my dogs loose. On hitting the ground, the snag split and broke up. Goggle-eyed, I stood rooted in my tracks and watched 3 big raccoons roll out of the busted old trunk. One started up the washout, running between us and the fire. Old Dan caught him, and the fight was on. The second raccoon headed down the washout. Little Ann caught him. Hearing a loud yell from Grandpa, I looked that way. Old Dan and that raccoon were fighting real close to his feet. He was yelling and beating at them with his hat. The judge and Papa ran to help. The third raccoon started climbing up the steep bank close to me. Just before reaching the top, his claws slipped in the icy mud. Tumbling end over end, down he came. I grabbed up a stick and threw it at him. Growling and showing his teeth, he started for me. I threw the fight to him then and there. Some 10 yards away, I looked back. He was climbing the bank again. That time he made it and disappeared into the thick cane. Hearing a squall of pain from little Ann, I turned. The raccoon was really working her over. He had climbed up on her back and was tearing and slashing. She couldn't shake him off. Grabbing a club from the ground, I ran to help her. Before we killed our raccoon, old Dan came tearing in. We stood and watched the fight. When the raccoon was dead, Papa picked it up and walked back to the fire. "How many raccoons were in that old tree?" Papa asked. "I saw 3, I said. "The one that got away climbed out over there." I pointed in the direction the raccoon had taken. I never should have pointed. My dogs turned at once and started bawling and clawing their way up the steep bank. I shouted and scolded for them to come back, but to no avail. They disappeared into the rattling cane. We stood still, listening to their voices. The sound died away in the roaring storm. Sitting down close to the fire, I buried my face in my arms and cried. I heard the judge say to my father, "This beats anything I've ever seen. Why, those dogs can read that boy's mind. He just pointed at that bank and away they went. I never saw anything like this. I can't understand some of the things they have done tonight. Hounds usually are not that smart. If they were collies or some other breed of dog, I would believe it. But they're just red-bone hounds, hunting dogs." Papa said, "I know what you mean. I've seen them do things I can never understand. I've never heard of hounds that ever had affection for anyone. But these dogs are different. Did you know they won't hunt with anyone but Billy? Not even me." Hearing my grandfather call my name, I went over and sat down by his side. Putting his arm around me, he said, "Now I wouldn't worry about those dogs, Billy. They'll be all right. It's not long till daylight now. Then we will go get them." I said, "Yeah, but what if the raccoon crosses that river? My dogs will follow them, and if they get wet, they could freeze." "We'll just have to wait and hope for the best," he said. "Now straighten up and quit whining. Act like a raccoon hunter. You don't see me bawling, and this old foot is paining me something awful." I felt better after my talk with Grandpa. "Now come on, let's skin these," Papa said. I got up to help him. After the skins were peeled from the carcasses, I had an idea. Holding one up close to the fire until it was warm, I took it over and wrapped it around Grandpa's foot. Chuckling, he said, "Boy, that feels good. Heat up another skin that way." I kept this up for the rest of the night.